he has co-authored a number of very sort of seminal papers in this area, including Trojan Horses of Race, which is, I believe, up on the website as one of the works cited here. This was a groundbreaking piece that took a look at how we understand race through looking at the questions of both communications, internet, how these things are structured. And he's also been doing, as I mentioned, some co-authored work with some of the leading figures in psychology on implicit bias. I think that you will find this an extremely informative session, and we are very much looking forward to your engagement. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for coming out early on Friday morning to do actually what's going to be really interesting but actually hard work. The title of the talk is an implicit bias primer, and as Professor Harris said, Kristen Lane is stranded on a plane. That happened last night. She is safely in Philadelphia and probably actually on another plane, hopefully headed out to Los Angeles. She is a psychologist in the Banaji lab at Harvard, and she will soon be an assistant professor at Bard College. And it would have been great to have her here to give you the details that only a true professional can, but lawyers are well trained to play professionals when we need to, and so we will try just that. She sent me her slides. I actually don't use slides generally, so I had to learn some technology that I actually have tried steadfastly to avoid. But you will see an eclectic combination of what I usually do using these kinds of mind mapping technologies as well as the standard PowerPoint slides. Let me start at the beginning with the idea of maybe bridging from the introduction that Professor Harris gave. What if you thought about race and racial justice and the racial system as a large computer system? What do hackers do to systems? They hack at the system by trying to figure out how the system works. How does the system work? Where does the power exist? How do vulnerabilities display themselves? And how might you exploit them, both for self-defense as well as to get change? And if you think about race fundamentally at the unit of abstraction of just being an individual's brain, race happens in the brain. Everything happens in the brain in some sense. How do you actually hack at race if it happens in the computing structure that is the brain? So think about, and Mahjong Banaji, probably the leading social psychologist of her generation, talks about mind bugs, the idea of bugs in the machine, in the software, but that's in our minds. And to get you a little bit motivated on this, I want to actually show you some monsters. It is all in the eye of the beholder, and it might look like a cheap trick, but I want you to actually look at this. So here are two monsters running down the hallway. You know what I'm going to ask in some sense. Which is the bigger monster? The little one, obviously, is the little one. This is the bigger one. And so that's pretty clear. The guy in the back is clearly bigger. But let's think about that. That's a blue line. I'm not exchanging the length of the line. It turns out they're identically shaped in terms of height. So if we actually remove the background, what do you see? You see the monsters that look a little bit more similar in height. And if you, again, look at the blue line, they're exactly the same height. So now you know intellectually that these two monsters, these two golems, are exactly the same height, but I will show you them again in context. Intellectually, you know they are the same height, and when you see it, nonetheless, you have this feeling the guy in the back is larger. A visual illusion, to be sure, but a very powerful one, and notwithstanding your intellectual acknowledgement, understanding, and the demonstration of proof that they are in fact the same size, they don't really look the same size, notwithstanding what I told you. Now, again, that might be just a cheap visual trick, but that's the kind of idea that I want you to have, a little more humility about what it is that you see, a little more humility about the categories with which our brains think. So let me divide the talk broadly into a section on science and a section on law, if we could maintain some such division. The section on science, Kristen would have done. The section on law, I would have done, but I think we'll be able to be okay with my filling in for both. So let's start at the very beginning, and I'm going to introduce a concept of racial schemas. Schemas generally look something like this. The idea is we need templates of knowledge to understand the world. If you actually think about the information that we receive through our senses in real time, it is overwhelming. What we see, what we hear, what we touch, what we smell, the bits of information, the throughput that goes through our senses is overwhelming. The chances that you could actually individually process every bit of information is ridiculous. Our brains can't handle that. So we have templates of knowledge that we actually use to chunk information to make it reasonable and processable. So everything that you're sitting on, anything that has a bottom, 4 sort of lines that come out, a thing in the back, you know it's a chair. Chairs look very different in color and shape, different kinds of infrastructure that chairs are, but you know what a chair is. You know what you're supposed to do with the chair, and you don't have to spend a lot of mental cycles figuring out what is this odd piece of plastic that is close to this thing called a desk. We use templates of knowledge to figure out the world because by necessity we must. We couldn't possibly give individual attention to every bit of information that comes our way. So schemas, categories, are part of the way we think. We could not live, we could not exist otherwise. Well, it turns out there are schemas for lots of things, not only chairs, but also people. Indeed, how you order food at a restaurant, right? When someone dressed in black walks you to a table and hands you a laminated sheet of paper, you don't ask, what is she doing? You actually know what the script is, and you know to actually order, eat. When they ask you, was everything great, you lie and say yes. You tip the person 15% by doubling the tax in California. These scripts are all built in, and we do it without normally worrying about how things go. But we do have scripts or schemas about people, and I'm going to talk a little bit about racial schemas in particular. So let me offer a very simplistic model that will be the basis for on which we will build in some of the science. It's a very simplistic model of categorization. The idea is this. You have an individual human being over here, and the idea is that you take the individual human being that you witness and apply mapping rules to put that human being into a particular category. I'm focusing on race, so we would be talking about racial categories. So for me, you see me as a human individual, I hope at least. You use visual inspection most likely, and information about my last name, Kong, as well as what I look like, to map me through particular culturally accepted rules into a particular racial category. At one time, you would have called me Oriental or something worse. Now you probably call me Asian. You don't know exactly ethnic information, but you'll say Asian, Asian American, something like that as the racial category. As soon as you put me into this box, particular racial meanings are activated. The idea is the meanings are activated almost immediately. Some of those meanings are cognitive beliefs. They're almost what we would call stereotypes. They're falsifiable predictions about this person. This person probably knows how to play the violin. This person probably got a perfect score on the math SAT. This person probably knows martial arts. Two out of those 3 are true. So I'll be interested in finding out which one. So it might be predictable, falsifiable statements, right, about something that's triggered by that. It might also be feelings, gut feelings, affective feelings, like, I like that look. Yeah, I don't like that look. If he were a she, I would really dig that look, but he's a he, so I don't like that look. So it's a feeling about approach or avoid, like or dislike, good or bad. That's not articulated as, I think a particular fact about the person. It's a general gut reaction and affect. And psychologists will distinguish between beliefs and stereotypes, which is sort of more cognitive statements about what this person is likely to have in terms of a particular attribute, and what people call attitudes, which are more like gut feelings about good or bad, like or dislike. And as soon as these meanings are activated, the idea is that it will alter, inevitably, your interaction with me in some sense. So if you actually put me into a particular category because of the stereotypes and or the attitudes, you will change the way you interact with me, which will then actually fill out a particular circle of interaction between you and me. A very simplistic model of just categorical thinking, right? There's nothing new here. But by actually spelling it out in this way, you actually learn something that's kind of useful. What I think is useful about this diagram is that it makes very concrete the idea that race is a social construction. When people say race is a social construction over and over again, and it has become something like a shibboleth among the critical left, what does it mean? On the one hand, of course, it's a social construction. We make up everything, but then a hammer is a social construction. Human beings made the hammer, and you can bludgeon other things, whether they be human or human-made. And so in some sense, everything is constructed by society, but that proves too much. when I see this diagram, this categorical thinking, this is how I think of the phrase or the claim that race is social construction. Every single one of these blue ovals are meaningfully constructed by society, by culture, received by history, and not preordained either by God or biology. So think about the mapping rules, the cultural mapping rules that you apply, and indeed the legal mapping rules you might apply. So think about the complexity with, say, biracial individuals. Whether we follow some rule of hypodescent that says that if you have one drop of black blood, you will be designated black, even if your parents were one self-designated as white, one self-designated as black. We have particular rules by which we place individuals into human categories, but those rules need not stay fixed, and they're oftentimes quite challenged. Even the categories are actually socially constructed. Right now we have 4 or 5, depending on how the census is thinking about things. We take Pacific Islanders out of Asians and put them with American Indians, or we put them back in. At some point, sociologists or quasi-sociologists and quasi-scientists thought that there were hundreds of categories of people. Now we have far fewer. But again, the categories that we've selected are, again, meaningfully man-made or human-made. And I think probably most importantly, the meanings associated, inscribed essentially on this body, because this body has been put into this particular category, is also a product of culture. At one time, people who looked like me were associated with the Chinese in California, who were the central illegal immigration problem of the time. It did not have a Latino face, it had a Chinese face. I'm not even Chinese, but that you get the point. So the meanings associated with this body versus the model minority myth that might exist right now actually is quite different from the vermin-like laborer who's coming here and debasing white labor by their willingness to do all kinds of work that they should, no self-respecting human being, i.e. a white person, would ever do. And these meanings change over time. They flip on the order of 100 years. And so in some sense, those things are made up. So every single oval is interestingly made up, is contested, as part of the politics and life that we engage in. And that gives concrete understanding. Now, most people, when they say racial social construction, they emphasize the meanings, i.e. the stereotypes are made up. Why do you think black people are more criminal or hostile, aggressive? That's a social construction. It's not naturally that way. They're not biologically more aggressive than other people. It's because society thinks of them that way and puts them in the conditions in which maybe some of that is actually displayed. But it turns out all the ovals are significant. Now, here's what's most interesting. As Professor Harris described, what we now come to believe is that we've essentially entered a colorblind society where, in fact, maybe we don't even see race, i.e. we don't even do mapping, but surely the meanings have all become fair and square, neutral. It's only merit. It's only the content of one's character, never simply the color of one's skin. And that's the question, the empirical question, that we need help resolving. Central question, in some sense, if you think that there's going to be automatic activation of meanings, is how to determine what's in the racial meanings. Now, for those people who think that they have so much self-control, autonomous executive control over their mind, such as to think that, no, there can't possibly be this sort of categorization that actually alters the way I think about important people, then I want to actually highlight that there's evidence of what people might call automatic activation. I'll give a couple examples. Maybe I'll start with this elevator walk example that Kristen Lane actually sent in. Here's the idea. So here's the experiment. A bunch of participants come online. They're actually told to make a 4-word sentence from 5 scrambled words. So they're given a task. Here are the 5 words. Only is cold, winter, the. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to think, the winter is cold, right? So it's just a task that you actually do. It's not necessarily speeded. So there are all these phrases, and they're told to actually make 4-word sentences out of each of them. What the point of that is to actually prime people with words that have an elderly stereotype. Carefully alone, stubborn, bingo, great. Other examples where Florida is included. Makes sense, right? All the participants think that the study has actually finished, and then they're walked out by the Confederate and say, okay, bye, thank you for the study. But as soon as they leave the elevator, that's when the real study starts. The stopwatch starts, and you're measuring how fast they walk down the hallway to the exit. That's the goal. And it turns out, depending on what you were primed with, either elderly words or control words, the rate at which you walked down to the exit was different. And it was different at a statistically significant level in both studies. And so the idea is that just by seeing a few words associated with the elderly, it turns out that you actually walked more leisurely down the hallway physically. And it's not as if you thought that this was in fact the causal reason why you walked down more slowly. It's stunning that you could just see something so briefly without even thinking about it, and it could influence your behavior. John Barge does this with a computer crash study, which I think is really also interesting. There's another example where poor undergraduate psych students are told to count the number of circles on a computer screen to decide whether they're even number or odd number. After the 130th iteration, the design of the experiment is for the computer to crash, and some Confederate to come in and say, you crashed it, you got to do it again. The whole point was to see how upset they would get. There were video cameras trained on their face to try to figure out how hostile they would be, and there were neutral, blind, third-party observers, blind to the point of the experiment, trying to decide just objectively on a scale how angry did they get on a 0 to 10 scale. Here's what they found, and here's the little variable that they tweaked. For one group of people, they flashed a black male face subliminally, under 20 milliseconds so that you actually can't consciously see it. For another group, they flash a white male face. And here are the interesting differences in the actual results. If you actually saw a black prime, a black face, but didn't see it in a conscious sense, but in an unconscious sense, your anger rating went to 2.79. If you saw a white prime, it was only 2.13. Now, it's on a 10-point scale, so I don't want to exaggerate the effect size, but the chances that this difference happened randomly is p less than 0.05. It's that less than 5% chance that this difference was just a random sort of people, where just angry people happen to be in the first group versus less angry in the other. Yet again, by seeing race, but of course when I say see race, I mean you didn't see it, you only saw it subconsciously. By seeing race, even subconsciously, you see an effect of this size. So if you think that you have heroic control over your brain, that you are, again, autonomous and sovereign over everything that you do, there are reasons to think that there are automatic activations of these racial schemas that alter your interaction with someone like me, indeed with everyone around you. So the real question then does become, okay, fine. Is there bad stuff in terms of racial meanings about particular racial categories? People always whine that we treat African Americans or Latinos or other kinds of minorities or women worse. Is it in fact true that you got junk in your head because you ask yourself, am I unfair to women? And you think, no, I'm not unfair to women. I love women. Some of my best friends are women. My mother is a woman. I have no reason to be against women. But the truth may be, what you say to yourself might not in fact be what's inside your head. So this is where the focus on implicit bias comes in. And the real problem that we're trying to struggle is the problem of opacity. If you actually ask people whether or not you're racist, it turns out the lines look like this. From Brown versus Board through the Civil Rights Movement to now, if you ask people, are you racist, no one ever says that he or she is racist. It's just about pride over their group. I mean, you can't, I don't think even Klans people, these people will say officially that they're racist. They're just about pro-in-group white pride. So no one, there is no more racism by self-reports, right? It's always justified in some theory. So if you ask people, there's impression management reasons. They don't want to get beaten up by the PC police. They don't want to lose their radio TV show. I'm not a racist, right? So that's the idea. If you ask me, unless you have it on tape in front of a national audience, I'm not going to actually say I'm racist. There's impression management reasons. But I think I need to emphasize it might be entirely sincere. We don't want to be too skeptical of people who honestly say, look, I don't think I have huge gender biases. I always focus on gender because being a man, gender is relatively blind to me. I think there's no gender problem. Being a minority, I think more about race. Being a minority man means that my blind spot is likely to be more about gender than race. And so I think about gender. I think, look, I'm completely supportive of women. I'm there with you all the time, right? No sexism here. I've read all the books. I got the red book. I got other books. I got the big books. It's not about me. So that might be the idea, but the question is, am I, even though I'm officially being sincere, do I still have junk in my head that actually influences my behavior? Well, how do you find out what's in the head if you can't actually ask people? Well, one way to do it is to ask really tricky questions. A lot of symbolic and modern racism scales, people like David Sears here at UCLA have done this as political scientists. You could ask indirect questions, not are you racist, but like, do you like busing? Do you want strong immigration control? Do you want to actually punish people a lot in the criminal justice system? The problem with that, and I'm not an expert necessarily in the literature, the problem certainly politically with those kinds of questions is that people will say that you are confounding political conservatism with racism. And of course, for many people, the answer is yeah. But it's not actually very persuasive for people who are on the fence or in the middle who think, no, you can actually be non-racist and still be politically conservative. They're not actually mutually exclusive. And to think that you're against busing and therefore you must be a symbolic racist is idiotic on all kinds of grounds, because there are lots of people of all races who might be against the idea of busing as a bad policy move. So think about what happened back in the good old days. This is by Katz and Bradley back in 1933. We used to ask Princeton undergrads what their beliefs were. And this is what Princeton undergrads would tell you back in 1933. What are your stereotypes of these groups? So Germans, they were not at all shy. We're saying we're scientifically minded, industrious, intelligent. Italians are impulsive, persistent, lazy, passionate, of course. Negroes, and of course that was the racial category that was used at the time, are superstitious, happy-go-lucky, musical. Let's see what we got about Jews. Yeah, shrewd, mercenary, not much has changed, right? So Chinese, superstitious, sly, conservative, tradition-loving, deceitful. Japanese, somewhat similar, a little bit more treacherous and aggressive. You should know that when we interned the Japanese, there were articles that ran in Time that explained how you might distinguish the Chinese and the Japanese, so that you knew, and they were pointing to differences in eyes and other kinds of stuff. And I love the line where they emphasize that the Chinese tend to walk with kind of like a happy shuffle, whereas the Japanese walked in a more stern military gait. So, in any case, that was then. Of course, this is now. They do this every decade or so. Ask Princeton students, what do you think about these people? If you ask the same question now, you know what the Princeton students say? They say, I'm not going to answer this question. This is offensive to me. They don't answer it. If you ask them a slightly different question, not what do you think? What do you think other people think? Then they go all out, and it turns out they produce the exact same list. It's like, I'm not racist, but if you want to ask that other guy, and the other yahoos who live around me, oh yeah, they got all kinds of biases, and they generate a list which is remarkably similar from the 1930s. So you can try to ask indirectly questions that get at people's racial meanings, but in the ideal sense, maybe you shouldn't ask. You should just measure. A scientist never asks a proton, what's your mass? They just measure it. Right? So why would you ask a human being what's a jump in your head if you could just measure it? When Kanye West insists that, in a slightly stuttering and not especially eloquent way, that President Bush doesn't like black people, let's hook the man up. If there's a racial polygraph, hook him up to the polygraph and ask, do you like black people? And don't even ask him to answer, just measure something like a galvanic skin response, and you can find out whether or not Bush likes black people. Is that possible? Would you want to do it? If it were possible, what it would look like? And of course, I say this facetiously in many senses. To think that there's a racial polygraph of this sort is to talk about fantasy. But that is the goal. Instead of actually asking questions of people, don't rely on self-reports. Actually start measuring. So maybe we could measure something like speed. And to show you why we would go for the need of speed, I'm going to do a standard Stroop task. So here's the goal, and I want everyone to do it together. Really, I do. What I want you to do is go down the columns, focus only on the color, and as quickly as possible, I just want you to tell me what the colors are. This, don't say it's purplish pink. I tested this on my spouse, and she said, oh, it's purplish pink. Now, let's just call it purple, because it'll slow you down. Let's call it purple. She's accurate, but she's sitting over there. So let's just call it purple, and we'll run through it, okay? So here's the go. Let's just see how it feels. When I say start, just run each column. Give me just the colors. Start.
Green, red, purple, green, blue, yellow, blue, red, purple, green, yellow, red, purple, yellow.
I don't know. Okay. You see, this is Kristen's part of the talk. And as a lawyer, you should never actually ask a question that you don't know the answer or the result. You would never do this on cross-examination, but I'm flying blind here. So let's try the next one. This would be, do the same thing, okay? Same columns. Ready, set, go. Green, red, purple, green, blue, yellow, red, purple, blue, yellow, red, purple, yellow. Oh, that was okay. That was good. I'm not actually measuring you in time. I will later measure you in time on another task, so be forewarned. Here's now, same thing. Just give me the colors. Don't look at the content. Just give me the colors. Go. Just the colors. Be blind to the content. I told you to be blind to the content. Okay, maybe again another cheap trick. But the idea here is to say that even though I told you to be blind to one aspect of the object that you were perceiving, it was actually quite difficult to do so. Most people on the average, some people are really good at this and you can train for it, but most people are on the order of twice as slow in going through that, because I told you to be blind to the content, but the content peeks in. Your brain says red, but the color is blue, and you're trying to figure out what the hell do I say, because I need to get this done quickly and I'm slightly embarrassed. And so that shows you that even if you don't want to attend to a particular attribute, that attribute is being perceived and altering the speed at which you actually do things. So when the word red, R-E-D, is colored red, you have an alignment of different schemas, both the color and the meaning, that lead you towards one direction. You fly through that. On the other hand, if you have countertypical pairings, where you have the word red but the color green, your brain doesn't really know what to do because they're not that tightly associated. Indeed, they're associated in opposite ways. In some sense, and I mean this only metaphorically, that kind of gut insight drives a lot of reaction time measurements. Could it be that I could actually have you play just a video game, and by playing the video game, I could have a way to measure the associations in your head? Like if I asked you, how much do you associate the word frog with Prince? Is there some way I could check? Is there some way I could have you play a video game so that you actually tell me things by how quickly you could run through particular word associations so that I could get some sense of how strongly you associate frog with Prince? So let's think about this with the IAT. And here are the instructions. And this actually, I will actually measure. What you will see are the following words. You will see words either about gender or about a field. In gender, they will be either male words or female words. These are the 4 male words you'll see. These are the 4 female words that you'll see. In terms of the field, you'll see science words: chemistry, physics, math, engineering, and biology. You'll also see humanities words. These are the 5 field words that you'll see. We were thinking about doing a race IAT, but we thought it would be maybe a little less threatening to do the gender one here. We'll find out. So these are the words that are going to be flashing on the screen. I just wanted to have you exposed to them so that you can't say, I've never seen these words in my life. What does biology mean? So what I want you to do on this experiment is, here it's very simple instructions. I want you to do, as quickly as possible, shout out left or right, depending on where it should be. And I'll give you details on how to know. I want you to go quickly, and don't try to correct any errors. Okay? And where I hear the mean or the mode of the answers is when I'm going to hit a space bar to actually measure the time. So this is not real science, right? But it is actually an attempt to try to get the mode of the response at a particular volume so that I know basically where the mode, the most popular time at which you guys answer, I'm going to take data that way by hitting my space bar. So here's what the experiment actually looks like, and this is where I feel like I really shouldn't be doing this because I don't know what the results will be, but we'll do it in any case. So just to be clear, oh no, why didn't this show up here? No, I did have to sign in. It's just that the mirroring mode is not working over here, which is not good.
Is this part of the experiment?
Yeah, well, it's a different kind of experiment. I'm trying to figure out. It won't show over there. Oh, this is evil. Okay, I'm trying to figure out. I have some hardware error. So the problem is I can't mirror this onto that because this computer will actually lock it down. This would have been so good. Let's see what I can do. So this is what you see on the screen. I'm trying to figure out maybe if I end the presentation. Okay, I'm going to try one more thing and let's see if it will actually work. No, it only shows it on my screen, which doesn't actually help at all. Well, I think...
Violin and martial arts.
Sherry's been haunted over that ever since. I'm going to take a betting pool later on. So unfortunately, I feel very bad about this, but there's no way. It's because this hardware has a problem. So if we end in time, I might try actually reloading it on a different machine. But I'm actually not going to be able to show you the IAT effect, which I feel really bad about. What you would have seen, if there's any other way. Okay, I'm going to try one last thing and see if I could do it that way. And if it doesn't work out, then we'll let it go. I'm thinking out of the box here. Just try something here. Hold on. Let's see if this works. No, I still get it on my screen. I'm sorry. All right, so what you would have seen was I would have had you do the following kind of study back and forth where you would call out whether you see a male word or a female word, and you would have said whether that is left or right, and then I would just be able to measure the time at which you did these things. And then the idea is what we see is data, and I'll show you data that actually represent what other people have done, data that shows and I'll try, at the end of the talk, I'm happy to actually try one more time on a slightly different thing, but I don't want to actually get too over, I don't want to be bogged down by this. I'll show you what the data look like in different kinds of contexts, but what you will have found is that we actually more tightly associate, let me view the presentation, we much more tightly associate gender with family, and gender with actually the humanities, female gender with humanities, and male with math and science. And the results are actually pretty substantial. And the way that the computer program would actually measure it is just in terms of milliseconds. So everyone actually answers on the order of 1 second or less. But it turns out that if I have a pairing, and it looks like this, the idea would be this. If I said male, hit this key, right? This is how you would do it individually. If I said female, hit this key. If I say math or science, hit this key. If I say anything humanities, hit this key. Notice that pair is called a stereotype typical pairing. So you have male and science, female and humanities on the same hand. When you go through that, we fly through that test. We go fairly quickly. Now, what if I switch it? I have male and humanities, female and science. That's an awkward pairing. It's kind of like doing this as a kid, right? Trying to figure out how that works. And it turns out we stutter a little bit, and there's a slight difference in terms of milliseconds, on the order of maybe 300 milliseconds in the ways that we sort things. And that actual difference in reaction time is what we call the implicit association test effect, the IAT effect. And this is a way where in some ways objectively you could just measure the strength of association between any two categories. In this case, the strength of the category between male and female and science and humanities. And when you do that, you get remarkable data that's really, really interesting. So let me show you some data, and again, at the end, if I could actually repair it in a different way, I'm happy to try it one more time. We find evidence of pervasive bias common across categories. For example, this is the kind of time. This is for national. So in one laboratory experiment, so if we think about the reaction time, so this is in milliseconds. So this is 388 milliseconds. This is minus 67 milliseconds. So if you actually give it to a bunch of people, their preference, this is a black-white attitude IAT. So you see black or white, and you see good or bad. We associate in terms of black faces and the word bad much more than white faces and bad, and vice versa. So it turns out there is a time lag on the order of 400 milliseconds, on the order of 0.4 seconds. There's a time lag when we have to associate black with good words in contrast to white with good words. The same thing happens when we're dealing with poor and rich. We associate rich with good words far more quickly than the poor. Same thing with foreign American, Jewish and Christian, gay and straight. Trees and birds are close to 51%, where we have seemingly equal attitude towards them. So just imagine, and I haven't detailed the actual methodology because I can show you the experiment, but basically you have people take the implicit association test. It's just a time reaction measure of how quickly you sort two categories and two sets of attitudes or two sets of attributes, and by actually seeing the time difference, you could see if we sort particular things more quickly together than others, and that could be used as a test of the strength of association. It turns out your subject position might not matter. So think about old people, right, and whether or not there's a preference for young or old people. So here's what the data look like. Let's follow this bright green line, which is for explicit self-reports. This is age, starting from 8 all the way up to 70. If you ask people, young kids at 8, whether or not you like old people, it turns out if this is 0, comes down, they don't like old people. It turns out when you're 15 or 17, you really dislike old people. And then as you get older, the power of motivated reasoning makes you like old people a little bit more. And by the time you're about 70, you're okay with old people. Explicitly. All right. Now what's really interesting is the implicit sort on whether or not you associate old or young faces with good or bad. It turns out it stays kind of constant, and actually as you get older, you associate old with worse things, right? Your attitude towards old people is measured by an implicit test. Gets worse as you get older, not better. And actually, I know that this is actually highly gendered, where you actually see more of it with women than men. For obvious reasons, if you're going to understand how our culture actually works. Notice that you have radical dissociation, where explicit self-reports, even if you think they're not lying, right, looks very different from what the implicit bias scores actually reveal. Don't ask, measure. You might get different results. It might not mean anything, but don't ask, measure, and see what you get. And we can see this in different kinds of ways, in different kinds of contexts. So, like straights over gays, what happens here? So the implicit bias of straights over gays. So if you ask straight respondents, right, what their preference is on a straight attitude over gays and lesbians, it turns out these are implicit bias scores. If you ask straight people whether you prefer, it's not asking. If you run the actual IAT on straight people, it turns out straight people have an 82.5% preference of straight people over gay people as measured by just an IAT effect, the number of seconds in some sense. Over here, if you look at gay people, it turns out there's only a 38.4% preference for white people. What's interesting about this is that white people, for straight people, the idea here is, it might be both. So the idea here, interestingly, is if you, in fact, are gay, you might think that you're immunized somehow from the actual biases. It is different. You don't have as strong implicit biases as the straight people, but to think that somehow all gay people have no preference in favor of straight people is wrong. It turns out there's a huge proportion that, in fact, maintain a preference for straight people. I think the race IAT stuff is most interesting. So let's look at whites over blacks. So if you run an IAT, and so these are white subjects and these are black subjects, the N is huge because these are tests done over the internet, which is on the order of 46,000 people over here. You never get a data set that large. And so think about what happens. If you run the IATs, you find out that that 88% of the white folks have a preference of whites over blacks, right? And this is how much the preference is. So obviously it looks a little bit like a bell curve because most people are not that extreme. This would be a 1.4 second difference in time, which is incredibly large if you're just trying to do the test. So here's the idea. It turns out if you actually test white people, they show a huge preference of whites over blacks on the straight attitude, on good or bad. If you ask African Americans, they bell curve around 0. So on the one hand, that's interesting news. By being African American, the mean bias is in fact 0. But you have to understand what that means, because we normally have pro-in-group biases. If you're a UCLA Bruin, you feel good about UCLA in contrast to USC. So normally, you should expect some preference for your own group on a straight attitude. It turns out African Americans don't, in fact, show an implicit preference for their group. It means half of them implicitly prefer whites. Half of them implicitly prefer African Americans. If you ask African Americans explicitly whether you like black people more than white people, they're actually off the charts in showing solidarity. They're more pro-black explicitly than whites are pro-white explicitly, because there isn't that much stigma to show solidarity if you're a person of color in that sense. So if you ask on a survey, again, African American people, are you good with African American people? Are they better in some sense than white people? They'll say yes, 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 I love black people. But if you actually measure them, it turns out they go bell curve around 0. It means half of them prefer white people over black people, at least as measured on this test. And of course, all of you as skeptical readers and members in the audience ought to be asking, well, what does this mean besides the fact that I don't play Xbox games very often? So we have to think about these results, which are kind of interesting. There's more stuff about gender and career. I don't think, I can show more data later on, but I don't want to talk about it. One thing that I want to make very clear is this idea of dissociation, that explicit self-reports lead to very different data as compared to implicit measures based on reaction times. If you ask people, in part because of impression management and in part because there is not pure access, introspection to the stuff in our heads, you get very different results than you would get if you actually ran IATs. And the dissociation is across the board. If you ask explicitly, so the top chart is explicit about in-group, out-group, whether you like them or not, whether they're good or bad. And not surprisingly, given that we live in a post-civil rights society, most people explicitly actually say 0, right? I don't prefer one over the other. They're not good or bad. The only place where you'll see some people some people confessing or telling you explicitly is on the gay straight, where they will show actually that they actually don't like gay people explicitly. There isn't enough of a social stigma, for example, against gay people such that they don't feel so bad saying, I just don't like gay people because I'm a straight person. Interestingly, when you actually look at the implicit biases, not measured by asking them, but just having them take the IAT, you get very different results, right? And these are millisecond differences for African Americans, for blacks as compared to whites. You get basically almost a 0.2 difference in time. You get differences for gay, Jewish, American versus foreign. You also get this interesting result with poor folks, because if you ask people explicitly whether you like rich people or poor people, people lie through their teeth, and they actually say they like poor people more, right? It's the Horatio Alger story, the poor are virtuous, the rich are conspicuous consumers of junk, and we like and we valorize the poor. It turns out our implicit biases against the poor are off the charts. Like 91% of us have implicit biases against poor people, even though officially we say we like poor people. So the whole sign has flipped, right? We say explicitly we love poor people, but implicitly it's clear that we hate poor people, at least as measured by this thing called the IAT. Of course, you need to try to figure out what that actually means in greater detail.
Jerry, is
Yeah.
foreign code for Asian and Latino? Is that, I keep seeing this category. What's it supposed to be?
What's the other one?
Foreign?
Foreign? No, it isn't. It is. It's just foreign versus American. And so what they do is they will actually pick foreign symbols or icons and then categories and American ones. So the question is I, you. So what they'll do is there have been a couple different studies, but one study could be in trying to decide whether or not you'll have words that say I, me, us, and then you, they, them, and then you'll also have American icons and foreign icons. And the question is how we sort them in terms of attitude. And so with us, we actually associate with, so the idea is that you prefer, you have a much more positive attitude toward American things than foreign things as measured by these kinds of icons. Divos and Banaji do a study on this dealing with Asians, and for example, they find convincing evidence that we associate Asians with foreign far more than white faces. So you have Asian faces, white faces, you have American icons, foreign icons. You're even told ex ante, okay, I'm going to show you some faces. All these faces are famous Asian American citizens. There aren't so many, so you have to pick like Christy Yamaguchi, you have to pick like some newscaster. Who else are you going to pick? There's no, what's a famous identifiable Asian American citizen? There's like 4, right? So you pick those, and then they said, and these are 4 famous non-American Europeans. They include people like Gerard Depardieu, Katerina Witt, and say, look, these are the Americans, these are the foreigners. That's the thing that we're going to run the study on. Now sort. It turns out it doesn't matter. We still sort the white faces much more closely with American than the Asian faces. And so that's what we mean by foreign, at least in that context. So what I'm showing, and I don't think, I'll wait and probably not talk about the stereotype thread stuff right now. I want to suggest, because there's a lot of detail, I want to suggest that the real interesting insight is since about 1995, 1997, there have been really interesting advances in social psychologists and cognitive neuroscientists trying to measure what's in our heads without asking. They use reaction time measurements. We can talk about fMRIs and other kinds of stuff later on. They use these kinds of video games that you yourself could actually take on Project Implicit at Harvard. If you just Googled Project Implicit, you would actually be able to take the IATs. And what they show is we can measure, and they're radically dissociated from explicit self-reports. And these implicit biases reflect what you understand to be the standard stereotypes of social classes that exist within our society. What you really need to know now is whether or not any of this matters. Is there a real-world impact that we should care about? Because if this is just milliseconds in our head, who cares, right? The immediate response is, maybe there's something there. I'm still a little skeptical. It's just a video game. Maybe it's because my left hand is slower than my right hand. All those kinds of things. Maybe it's because you prime me one way or the other. Did you randomize the blocks? Did you do it in this way? All those good scientific questions have been asked and I think adequately answered. So there is some such effect, but the real question is, who cares? Do milliseconds in fact matter? And the argument that I'm going to suggest is the data suggests that milliseconds do matter in different kinds of ways. Generally speaking, you should understand, and we all understand this, that stereotypes or schemas guide our interpretation of ambiguous events. And there's lots of really good psychological studies that happened a long time ago that I could just refer you to. So people like Duncan back in 1976 made videos of ambiguous interactions. And the question is, was this person aggressive as, say, a panhandler asking for stuff? And depending on whether the person was white or black, you had very different reactions on the amount of aggressiveness that was perceived. Sagar and Sochfield make line drawings, and they have a little narrative just by showing pictures between 2 school kids. The only difference they make is they shade in the color of the characters a little bit more. Depending on whether they shade the colors in a little bit darker, you again have different views on how aggressive the darker skinned boy was versus another. There are these Pygmalion studies, the stuff that would never get past human subjects clearance in modern academic culture. But Rosenthal and Jacobson back in 1968 did this amazing study that's just terrifying. They went into a school system and they said, we're going to give these kids an IQ test. These were very young kids, I think like kindergarten or so. And they told the teachers, look, we've identified these 20% as the real overachievers. We're going to come back in a year to see whether they in fact overachieve. Don't tell the students. Don't tell the parents. It's just you and me. It's confidential. It's for the study. You can't tell them. They come back and lo and behold, the 20% who had been identified did in fact overachieve. What the teachers didn't know was that the 20% were randomly selected. It had nothing to do with an IQ test, but the idea is the poverty of low expectations and or the richness of high expectations alter the actual results. So this is the Pygmalion study, and there are lots of examples of doing just this. Darley and Gross have a girl videotaped manipulating blocks and solving some problems. And people are given two different groups of people are given basically resume, giving the demographics of this person. And the question is essentially, how smart are they? If you give them just the different resumes about how rich the kid is, and you ask them, on this information, can you tell me how smart this person is? You see no results. You see no differences. If you show just the videotape, you see no differences. If you show them the videotape that's ambiguous, but also feed them the resume that gives them a theory, an expectation that because this person is poorer, the person would do worse, you actually see differences in results, where people will take the exact same videotape, and depending on whether they were given a resume that says that this person was poor or rich, will interpret the ability of the child as being higher or lower. So in some sense, this is not news. In no way is this connected to the reaction time measurements, but there is great data that suggests that our theories, right, our expectations, our schemas are like theories to the data, and unless there's some really convincing reason for me to think otherwise, I will interpret the data in accordance with the theory that I have, which are the racial scripts or the schemas that are in our head. I'll give you one more example. Margaret Shee, who does all the stereotype threat literature that I could, studies that I could show you, does the following. And here's the interesting thing, right? So here's how it is that particular cues about a person, how you categorize a particular individual into a category might alter the way you remember things. So the participants are told to read a college application. On the top, it's the exact same thing with a name different, I guess, but on the top they just write Asian American high school student or female high school student or high school student. It's just scribbled on the top. That's all that there is. And in the actual file is the SAT math score. But later on, when they're told, do you recall that candidate's SAT math score? It turns out if it said Asian student, they recall this number. If it's neither, it's controlled. If it's female, they think it's low. This is how bad our memories are as guided by the cues that exist in the situation. Similar study, in which case where there's an email interaction between someone who's being someone who's a participant in the experiment and someone who turns out to be a Confederate. In the email interaction, information is released. The SAT score is released in the back and forth email exchange. What's the only difference is either the email is Chen at Harvard, Amy at Harvard, or AC at harvard.edu to prime you to think either Asian woman or someone in between. AC, you don't even really know. And then later on the question is, what were their scores? Look at the math. For math, if they're Asian, they're recorded up at 732. For female, they're much lower, right, at 726 or so. For verbal, it turns out to be just the opposite. If it was Chen, they remember this, and if it's female, they remember that. Again, you always have to make sure what the scales are, 714 to 732. It's not 0 to 732. You have to make sure that the magnitude effect sizes are things that you care about. But these are not trivial effects in terms of our memory. So the basic point is, if you have schemas in your head, even though you think you have a really good memory, it turns out you don't remember or you don't perceive in the ways that you think you do in a neutral way. And so if you think you are colorblind in some sense, I'm sorry to suggest otherwise. So there's evidence that there are biased interpretations that are generated by the implicit bias in our heads. There is one study called that I call agentic backlash, where Laurie Rudman does this in 2001. And it's basically that you have male and female job candidates, and they're supposed to be identical, because there's a video interview that's scripted exactly the same, and the actual portfolio, the resume and the essay look exactly the same, and they're controlling it. The only thing that they're flipping is gender. For a particular type of job, however, which is called the androgynous job condition, the condition in which where you have to be both a agentic and male, kind of a leadership, go-get-em, aggressive, ambitious kind of person, but also a people person. Have to actually talk with folks and be able to deal with conflict, the kinds of stuff that we designate as more female than male. In that condition, agentic females were punished in a way that agentic males were not. Males who were ambitious and go-get-em aggressive were not punished in this condition, whereas females who were punished. And it turns out this difference in hireability ranking was correlated with implicit bias scores, associating men and women with either agentic qualities, which are kind of these male leadership qualities, versus communal qualities, which are viewed as more female. So there's some evidence now that your implicit bias scores actually do predict things like how you evaluate people potentially when you hired them. I'm just going to go through a couple more examples and then talk about, and then I want to make sure that we have plenty of time to go back and forth on questions. The other way that it might influence the real world is what I call nonverbal leakage. So our body language is really important. McConnell and Liebel do the most important study back in 2001. What they do is they have people do IATs on race, on black and white, and then they actually script an interaction with a black Confederate experimenter. And they're trying to figure out whether or not the white participant in the experiment actually relates in a friendly way or a non-friendly way with the black Confederate. It turns out social psychologists have a very sophisticated grammar with which you could actually measure body language. So they actually break it all down. They call it eye contact, forward body lean, whether they decide to sit close to someone or far away, whether they cross their arms like this, which is not so friendly, where they open it up where it is friendly, whether they laugh at the person's jokes, whether they make whether they stutter or make word errors. There are all kinds of things that they actually measure. And there are people who don't know what the person's implicit bias scores are who make neutral third-party observations of how friendly the interaction is. And what they find out is a correlation between your implicit bias scores and the actual interaction rating. So depending on how you could have neutral third judges say, well, this was a friendly or not friendly interaction. You could have the actual person, the experimenter, the black Confederate, who said, in that interaction, I didn't feel that it was a good interaction. They measure those by asking people, and then they compare it to the IAT scores, and then you see a correlation. R is Pearson's R, and we don't have to talk about the statistics, but the idea is there's a correlation between one's implicit bias scores against African Americans and the awkwardness of the body language. And what social psychologists have long determined is if I'm awkward to you, you're awkward back to me, and on the merits, the interview stops early. And on the merits, I think, we didn't click, this was not very good. So Wurdzan and Cooper, Princeton psychologists back in 1974, do this beautifully. They try to figure out how black interviewees react with white interviewers. They try to code up the body language and say, I noticed some differences. Then they train white interviewees to have the exact same body language as black interviewees. And it turns out the results are exactly the same. So you have white interviewees who are trained to act like the black interviewees, and then it turns out the white interviewers say, well, these white interviewees are not very good, and on the merits, again, the interview goes bad. So what I'm saying is, if I'm awkward to you, you're awkward to me, and it ends, again, on the merits as a bad interview. And you know how important interviews and social interactions actually matter. And it's not just an interview for a job, for every interaction. Whether or not you make friendships, whether or not you could raise rain as a love partner, whether or not you're getting along with someone who might give you a scoop on a hot stock tip or a job opening, or who you're inviting over for dinner, or whether you're going to be voted class president. All these things over and over, summed over the duration of one's life, over entire groups of people, could have non-trivial impacts. So you should know that there's self-fulfilling prophecies that come from potentially nonverbal leakage. I'll stop in terms of the real-world impact by giving you some evidence of really deadly mistakes where milliseconds absolutely do matter. Everyone knows about the tragedy of Amadou Diallo, who was shot at least 43 times by New York City cops who thought that he had a gun when he was just pulling out his wallet. Joshua Correll in 2002, do a great study on what they call shooter bias. And it's literally a video game. So you either have white people or black people holding guns or something less threatening like a Coke can or a cell phone. And the goal is, if you see a gun, shoot. If you don't see a gun, push a non-shoot button. Right? That's the thing. If you give people enough time, there are no errors. It gets most interesting when you start forcing them to decide in less and less time. As you force errors, it turns out that we clearly associate white faces less with guns than black faces with guns. And what the results look like are this. If you force people to make errors, we make more false alarms with African Americans. So we think they have a gun when they don't, and we shoot. Right? We have more misses with whites. They have a gun, but we don't see the gun, and we say don't shoot. We make the exact same errors, and what's really important to understand is that African Americans have the exact same shooter bias. So African American participants playing this game show the exact same shooter bias as white cops. They're not actual cops as white participants, right? There's no evidence there's actually any difference. And it's not, further studies suggest it's not really a different attitude whether you like black people or you like white people. It's in fact a stereotype that's driving it. If you associate black male faces with guns more, it turns out you'll shoot faster. It's a stereotype effect, not an attitudinal effect. So you might really like black people. You might yourself be black, your family's black, you like black people. That doesn't immunize you from associating black male faces with guns. And that might be what's driving this effect, which is really interesting. And then in a weird follow-up on race and weapons, just look at this. They do an IAT where we're trying to associate non-harmful objects such as these with black or white, and weapons, but these are not weapons we see in modern America, right? So it's not as if you were primed to see young African American carrying maces, right? That's not how things work. But it's just trying to figure out, do we think that they're hostile in some sense? And even on this study, right, self-reported data in terms of race weapons stereotype looks like this, right? This is if you actually ask questions, right? If you ask them and they fill out a survey, you see these are kind of standard deviations off the mean. So it's kind of it's a scale that actually is in terms of something called standard deviation, so that you could actually figure out how off they are from a mean if you expect a bell curve. That's not so important because we're not actually doing this at that level of detail. But the idea is, if you ask people explicitly, right, all of these are not especially large effect sizes. They're close, they're pretty small. So in some ways, like African Americans, if you ask explicitly, don't see any relationship between those crazy weapons and African Americans. There's almost nothing here, but you see some, right? If this is a medium level, which is half a standard deviation, all the people, white, Asian, Hispanic, and black, have just a little bit of an association, but they're not actually that large of an effect. What happens if you run IATs on them? It's actually much more significant. This is the same recalibrated scale of a standard deviation, and it turns out whites are off, there's a huge standard deviation in favor of associating African Americans with weapons, and we see the same thing for Asian and Hispanics, which are essentially the same. And even for African Americans, you see a substantial connection between these old weapons and African Americans. It exists. And what we want to emphasize is, again, the idea of a dissociation that haunts us all, right? These are very small, and for African Americans, almost nothing, but you actually get them much bigger as an implicit effect because in some ways, our society leaves a thumbprint on our minds. And whether you like it or not, there's a smudge. And the smudge actually might matter, especially if you immerse yourself in a culture that emphasizes the violence of African Americans day in and day out, even with different kinds of weapons. There's lots of stuff to be doubtful about all this stuff, and I don't know, and in some ways I don't want to go through too much of it. I think I want to use question and answer to go through it. If you're a scientist, you should care about what we call construct validity. If you're a scientist, you should care about what we call predictive validity. If you're a scientist, you should care about external validity. On all these things, like construct validity asks, like, what is this thing that you're measuring, this thing called implicit bias? I don't really know what it is. Is it the same thing as explicit bias? Is it racism? I don't know what it is. You tell me that you can measure it with milliseconds, but I don't know what it is, and I feel uncomfortable making any kind of legal policy or social policy based on it. So what is this thing, this platonic thing that's in our head when we can only measure differences in time? Predictive validity is fine. You show me that there might be some impact, but are you really confident that it will change what we do in terms of real behavior? Because as lawyers, we care about real behavior. I should suggest that in a meta-analysis done by Pullman to be published in 2007, where they basically take every single IAT study that's been done that's connected with anything like real-world behavior, like how you evaluate someone, whether you shoot faster, whether you decide to do X or Y, something that we might care in the real world and call as discrimination, you find out that it turns out that there is a correlation on the order of 0.25. That's not a very strong correlation, but with psychometric properties, we're all complicated machines. It turns out you rarely get R values that are that much higher than that when you actually measure people to try to predict their behavior. And in the meta-analysis, you should find, it's interesting what you find out, that in many ways, the implicit bias, it turns out explicit self-reports, like if you ask people, do you like Bush more than Gore?
people will actually tell you explicitly. And the explicit self-reports give you really good information about Bush versus Gore, which one you like better, because there's no reason to hide that stuff in some sense. And we haven't internalized any need to hide that stuff. If you like Coke versus Pepsi, it turns out for consumer products, there's no impression management reasons, and we have pretty good introspective access to what we like or dislike. But when it comes to things that are hot-button items related to prejudice or hatred, implicit measures like the IAT better predict your behavior on things such as this. So there have been studies that found predictive validity on issues such as how comfortable we are around gay men, around black people, how we evaluate essays, whether or not we cut funding for student organizations, whether we oppose affirmative action, how we evaluate women in terms of their potential hireability. I don't want to actually brush under the rug lots of complexity here and lots of challenges. You should not view individual human beings as automaton in any sort of sense. We're deeply complicated on all kinds of grounds, and I don't want you to think that because you scored somehow on an IAT, it necessarily means you will be X, Y, or Z. There's way too many complicated factors, not only individually but also organizationally. That said, if you think there's absolutely no data that these milliseconds matter outside of the context of shooting someone, it turns out there are data that suggests that these implicit biases have impact in the real world in ways that even legal systems ought to take care of and respond to in a serious way. And I can talk more about the data as people have questions. There are all kinds of other objections and or justifications, and I'm trying to figure out what, if anything, I could talk about. I think I'm going to try to leverage the question and answers to provide more data. I think the only other thing that I want to spot as an interesting set of issues before I just give you a very brief overview of some of the legal implications that I've talked about is to say, well, there might be defenses, right? So think about what happens. If the science starts accumulating the fact that there are these weird pervasive biases as measured by reaction time measurements, the immediate response is say, well, that instrument is broken. You see 300 millisecond differences, but that's because you prefer left hand over right hand. That's crazy. It can't possibly mean anything. But the data show, no, there are reaction time differences, and it's pervasive. We see it in Germany, we see it in Japan, we see it between Koreans and Japanese, we see it everywhere. You can't say it doesn't exist. What's the next response? Well, fine, you see something, but it's really not about racism in any sense. I don't know why you call it racism. If Jesse Jackson would show it, how can you call it racism? Interesting question, right? We want to talk about that. And of course, the immediate response is, why not? Why couldn't Jesse Jackson have absorbed a stereotype that associates black male faces with guns when he consumes the same popular media that we all do? How sure are you that he would be immunized from that stereotype, notwithstanding his positive attitude and even his history? Maybe, maybe not. We have to ask that hard question. You have to ask the other kinds of difficult questions that objectors will put up include questions about, well, even if this millisecond difference exists, even if it's somehow associated with something called race or racism that I might plausibly care about, how do you know it actually changes the real world? Because I'm not into that thought police stuff. All you crazy liberals who always want to discipline people because they have impure thoughts, we have a First Amendment, we have a liberal state, we don't want to punish people just for having impure thoughts. I'm going to make sure that it influences behavior, but now there's increasing evidence that behavior does change. But it's never an atomistic A causes B causes C, and we could actually see it clearly, and here's the ticker tape that shows it. But in terms of gravitational-like causal forces, these implicit biases seem to have an impact on behavior, real-world behavior that we ought to care about, in which case the last stop, if that's demonstrated even more convincingly by the science, the last stop will be something like this. Well, okay, fine. You've shown me this thing called implicit bias exists based on these reaction time measurements. You've shown me that it has something to do maybe with race or gender or other stuff. You've also shown me that on the margins it does make me change the way I deal with these people, whether I shoot them, whether I fund them, whether I hire them. Okay, so maybe I'm not as colorblind, but you know what? You can't blame me for it for at least two reasons. One is it's natural. You can say it's hardwired. You can say it's built into our brains. We always prefer certain things. We prefer our in-groups to out-groups. I'm white, I'm in-group, 75% of the country is white. Of course I'm going to prefer other white people. It's hardwired. It's evolutionarily designed. It's either approach or avoid, fight or flight. It's hardwired. There's a reason why I don't like spiders and why I like flowers. And if you run the IAT, we show it. It's because, not God necessarily, but evolution made me this way. So don't blame me. Certainly don't give me legal liability when it's natural. Put another way, correction is impossible. We have these biases. You flip it. You contest the existence of these biases all the way in. But then if the science becomes convincing that these biases exist and they're real and they have an impact, immediately you should expect people saying, it's natural. So why are you blaming me for it? You can't blame me for something that I was designed to have. Right? You could predict exactly this move. And I want to suggest that that is too quick a move on all kinds of grounds. The social construction of a race matters. The fact that things might be hardwired doesn't mean that today's specific versions of racial mechanics are hardwired. I think it's fair to say that we have to think in categories. We have to chunk. But there's no reason to think that today's particular racial categories are the ways that we have to chunk on all kinds of grounds. Why should Asian Indians be included with East Asians in the construction of Asian America? Why do we include Pakistan as Asian American but not Afghanistan? They're right next to each other. Why? Well, why are they the Arabs and the terrorists? And well, I guess Pakistan might also be concerned. We might be concerned about those people. But think about all the choices that we've made. Why are Filipinos in the same category as East Asians? Right? Why would Koreans ever want to be in with Japanese? There are lots of mapping rules that we've adopted and accepted. You have to ask, well, where were those created? You think those were hardwired? Evolution doesn't work that fast. Think about the flip in terms of racial meanings associated, again, with Asian bodies. At one time, they were just vermin who were just used as cheap labor to do the sugarcane fields, right? To do the railroads, to use and abuse and to destroy as cheap labor who could not do anything more. And now you have the stereotype that they are the super whiz kids who are winning all the Westinghouse competitions. That happened inside of 150 years. Evolution doesn't work that fast. So there's no, really, it doesn't on any stretch, and I don't think intelligent design would either. So the point here is, for you to think that some aspects might be hardwired doesn't mean that the relevant things that we care about, including racial meanings, are hardwired. And the final thing is, look, not everyone has implicit group bias. African American, the average person, has zero bias, in some sense, pro-white or pro-black. It's in part because the natural tendency to have a pro-in-group bias in favor of your people is all dampened down by what society tells you day in and day out, that you're at the bottom and you deserve to be at the bottom. So you can't say society has no impact on implicit biases. They do. And they are, in some ways, deeply malleable. Even if they are unconscious and they are not in our awareness and they are not in our control, there's great evidence now that implicit biases are highly malleable in kind of odd ways. I'm going to give you two experiments. And I've been going a long time, but I want to get some exposure to these experiments. It turns out, for example, that in one study, people were given like a kind of a history questionnaire to identify these people. Who are these people? Do you know them? It's like Trivial Pursuit history. In one group, you had good black people and bad white people. And again, who are you going to pick? Tiger Woods, interesting question, because the racial mapping rules put him to black instead of Asian. Although, anyone who knows about his biography, that's a contested question. Why should he be black instead of Asian? But of course, morphologically and visually through cultural mapping rules, we think of him as black, and so he's black. So he's a good black. Charles Manson, not a good white, right? So bad white, okay? So that's one group of people who do that experiment. I mean, you got to go for the gusto, right? Here's the countertypical. Oh, I'm sorry, I messed that up. That shows you my biases. So in some ways, this is the counter. What I showed you was the countertypical initially. The idea is that the stereotypes usually run the other way. So what I just showed you was the countertypical one, and what I'm going to show you is in some ways the typical one. And this is what's typical. We have the following. We have admired white exemplar like Jim Carrey, and I guess this must be after the chase scene. Dislike black exemplar O.J. Simpson. But of course this raises all kinds of interesting questions about cultural studies, right? They also included Martin Luther King as liked African, as good black, and they included Malcolm X as bad black. No. Yeah, they did. Yeah, Malcolm X. I'm trying to grapple with that, but they included Malcolm X as the bad black by pre-testing, just to see what people's attitudes were. They're just being descriptive here, and not intensely normative. So, depending on which history questionnaire you saw before your IAT, here's what we find out. If you actually saw a history question where you had no racial exemplars, these are the results that you had, right? So I'm going to look at the yellow ones. This is what your IIT scores look like. It looks like there's a substantial preference for whites, right? This is what it means in terms of just the reaction time measurements, right? After 24 hours, they measured it, and it turns out it goes down a little bit. It's in part because people usually get just faster when they actually have practice on the test. If they're given a pro-white exemplar with if they're given a good white, bad black exposure, it turns out it's actually roughly the same. You might think it looks significantly different, but I think some of the stuff wasn't exactly statistically significant, but I don't have the data with me, so I can't be sure. What's interesting is that if you feed people a pro-black exemplar, i.e. activate in people's minds Tiger Woods, Martin Luther King, Bill Cosby, and this is before all the stuff that happened, I guess, with the recent... Maybe it would actually help more, actually, frankly, with white people. Uncertain, right? So these are all contested spaces, right, in terms of identity. But it turns out that implicit biases cut down by almost a half, and it sticks for 24 hours. So just a little exposure of a positive countertypical stereotype exemplar, someone like a Bill Cosby, someone like a Martin Luther King, right, actually has an impact on how we do IATs. That's stunning, and it sticks for 24 hours. You know how much TV we watch? We watch, the households, they have on average 6 to 7 hours a day, right? Think about how many exposures to potentially the standard stuff and maybe the countertypical stuff that you could actually have through mass media consumption, which could have an impact on how we could actually change implicit biases. I'll give you one more. There's another interesting experiment by Irene Blair of Colorado who asked people to imagine either a Caribbean vacation in great detail for about 5 minutes, or to imagine a very strong agentic woman who's a leader of a business, what she's wearing, what she's doing at the office, all kinds of stuff for 5 minutes. And then they ran an IAT on gender. It turns out just imagining for 5 minutes what it means to have a strong, powerful woman, right? Just imagining what that might mean actually decreased the gender bias based on the IAT. There are actual field studies. So Nilanjana Dasgupta of UMass does this great co-ed study. And it turns out she measures the IAT of people. Before they start, of women, again, on the gender bias on women, of women before they go to college. Some go to a co-ed college, some go to a women's college. After 1 year, the IAT is done again on the same group. And they were pretty good about not having a lot of attrition in the group and other kinds of stuff. For the women who went to the co-ed college, and they were roughly comparable New England schools, if they went to the co-ed college, their implicit bias against women go up. These are women's biases against women. They go up as measured by the IAT. On the other hand, the women who went to the the all-women's college, their biases on average go down to 0. They try to evaluate what's going on. They try to figure out, are they taking women's studies courses? Are they taking feminism classes? Are they part of some, crazy feminist group in the, all kinds of stuff. They're trying to figure out all the variables. They boil it down. They notice one interesting connection. They see something with science classes. And they're trying to figure out what's going on there. Ultimately, they find out, the real reason, the one variable that correlates with this stuff, is how many women faculty or senior administrators they interacted with. And it turns out that in all women's colleges, about half of the science and math teachers are women, whereas in co-ed colleges, the science teachers are almost all men. And that's why they saw the science effect. It turns out the one thing that correlated was not whether they took women's studies classes or anything like that. The one thing that really mattered was whether or not they had women faculty and deans of significance that they interacted with. So this is at least one study. This is out in the field, so it has some ecological validity. It's not just a lab experiment that people will contest. It's just a lab experiment. It's also longitudinal over time, because you're following the same group of people over time, and it's kind of telling that something else might be going on. But there are ways to both increase and decrease implicit bias by the situation that you actually put people in. So there are all kinds of variables. This is, I do want to, I know I've been talking a long time. There are lots of reasons to think that the situation, as well as some personality features of individuals, could alter the way we think about implicit bias. And maybe I'll go into details later. I won't open them up. I just wanted to say, to the extent that you thought that this was a ghost in the machine that we have no control over, simply because we're unconscious of them. That means we are not aware of them, and we don't have direct control over them, like in terms of an executive function. I shall not be sexist, and henceforth I shall not be sexist. Even if we don't have that control, it might be that by changing the structure, the environment, what's up on the walls, the pictures that you see, and the pictures that you're exposed to could alter your amount of implicit bias and whether it triggers particular types of behavior. There's another argument that I just want to put out there that people will say to justify it, and they'll basically say it's just rational. What I mean by that is, it won't take long for people to say, look, if I associate black male faces with guns more than white male faces, it's not because I'm racist, it's not because there was an evolutionary design to lead me there. It's because you know what? Black males carry more guns than white males. That's why. I'm just a rational processor of base rate statistics. Call me Mr. Bayesian, but I'm the rational racist. And if you're going to call me racist, I'll take it. I'm a rational racist. Bring it on. That's why I have these views. I've read the Wall Street Journal. I know all the data, and all the data give me all these probabilities. And the reason why I treat you differently is I know you're going to have a baby. I know you're going to take a mommy track, and therefore I don't treat you as seriously, because as human capital, you have less value to me. Because I've done the statistics. Here's the statistics, right? Here's you fall into this group, 72.3%, and you're going to have a baby in the next 3 years. That's why I'm discounting my actual contribution to your life, because I'm being rational about it. Right? Lots of people say this, right? And in some sense, what could possibly be wrong with being as rational as possible based on the best evidence? Now, there's all kinds of reasons to be skeptical about that, including reasons that are not even just moral objections. You should know that our current law doesn't allow that. Like, for example, if you run a restaurant and say, look, I just want to make money. I'm just into the color green, and that's the only color I see. But it turns out all my diners really hate black people, and they'll feel really bad if a black hostess sits them down, and they won't eat as much. I love black people, I really do. Some of my best friends are black people, but I need to make money, and so I'm not going to do it. I'm just being rational. It's called pass-through discrimination, and our federal civil rights laws don't allow it. You can't say, I'm not racist, my clientele is, and that's why I'm acting on it. That's not a good reason. Legally, you might think that's not a good reason morally as well, but it's not a good reason legally. So you can't just say, I'm being rational, therefore get off my back, because being, quote, rational at that level doesn't work. Think about accommodation laws, about ramps up to, like, that we don't have up here, right? If you needed someone with a wheelchair to come up, you might say, I'm being rational. You know how many people with wheelchairs come up here? Like a year? Like one. And it's going to cost $N,000? It's not rational. On what basis do you think it makes sense for me to build a ramp? Right? I've done the spreadsheet. Here's the spreadsheet. Now it's rational. It's negative. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. It's not rational. At which point you might say, that's not good enough. It's an accommodation law. For equality's sake, you need to build in the ramps if you change this room. We're not having the conversation about whether it's rational in some sense. Still, this argument will come in, and I want to suggest that even if you think that, well, it should be legal as long as it's rational, it should be moral as long as it's rational, you should be skeptical about any claims that you are, in fact, a perfect Bayesian calculator of statistics. First of all, you get a lot of garbage in lots of ways. What I mean by that, I guess this is too much detail. The idea is, how do you actually create your base rates, the probabilities? Do you really think that people read the books and read the data, get the best? You think there's really that good data? No. You watch TV. What are your base rates Right? If you're in Idaho, what is your view about the criminality of black people? Where does that data come in? And if you put in garbage into your brain, you'll get garbage in terms of the underlying base rates. And there's heroic evidence that all people who think they're such rational discriminators have awful information about base rates. We completely over-predict, for example, the percentage of black people that actually live in the United States. You ask people in cities, how many black people are there? They think it's like 40%, 50%. There aren't that many of them in the United States, it turns out. But we overestimate lots of things. So there's lots of garbage in that comes in. Independent of that, even if good data comes in, there are lots of processing errors. And these are just some psychological phenomena. Maybe I'll talk a little bit about them. There are illusory correlations. Whenever two salient things happen, we tend to overestimate the probabilities. So if I give you a deck of cards, for example, of white faces, and 10% of them are called criminals. If I give you a deck of cards that are black faces, and 10% of them are also criminal, and I kind of mix it up and then give you a sample of them. So what you actually see are 10%, right, of both races being criminals. But in the actual deck that I give you, about 75% of the people are white, and only 25% are black, or 80% are white and 20% are black. As we go through the cards, it turns out when you see a black and crime put together, those things are both salient. It creates an illusory correlation in our minds that emphasizes that as being interesting, and therefore if you ask them afterwards, what percentage of the white faces that you saw were criminals? What percentage of the black faces that you saw were criminal? We'll overestimate the black and criminal as compared to the white and criminal through this phenomenon that's called illusory correlation. There are all kinds of other concerns. There's something called outgroup essentialism, where basically it's an extension of what people call the fundamental attribution error. This is basically this. If good things happen to you or us, let me do it this way. If good things happen to me, I tend to think it's because I'm a good person. By nature, I deserved it. It's because of who I am. I'm really a smart person. On the other hand, if bad things happen to me, bad luck. Either the system was rigged, bad luck, just didn't have my day. I give an excuse. If good things happen to other people, especially my opponents, lucky. Didn't deserve it, something happened. If bad things happen to them, if you know those people, they deserve it because that's who they are. They're lazy. So we adopt dispositionist explanations for good things for ourselves. It's our inherent nature. But situational explanations for bad things. It was an accident. It was just the environment. We flip it for the outgroup. If bad things happen to them, it's because those lazy people, they never get anything right. It's those people. They're culturally or genetically defective. On the other hand, if good things happen to them, well, see, that's the unusual one, right? That's the good one who actually hustled and did all kinds of stuff. There's something unusual. And there's great data that we engage in just this, outgroup essentialism. So even if you see, right, data that might be accurate, our tendencies, right, our majority tendencies is to actually biologize or make essential negative attributes of outgroups and do just the opposite for us. And that leads to a particular effect on race relations. There's other kinds of stuff, but it's probably not even worth talking about it because I've gone into too great of a detail. I want to try to pull back and show you just the big picture. And the big picture looks just like this. We think we live in a world that is, quote, colorblind, or so many people want to tell us. It turns out racial meanings are in our heads. We now have nascent ways to measure them. Now we have increasing evidence that these things that we can measure through reaction times actually have an impact on real-world behavior outside of the lab. It is not yet decisive evidence. There is an increasing backlash both within the scientific community and certainly within the legal community on how this data ought to be interpreted. And the good thing with at least a superficial understanding of science is that over time the scientific method, right, will actually reach an equilibrium where there will be a consensus. At one time, people were really worried about global warming being a hoax or not. People weren't sure whether man-made carbon emissions were actually increasing the temperature of the world. By this time, and certainly 50 years from now, there will be deep consensus within the scientific community that it in fact is real. So it might well be that all of this is just hot air, and somehow someone will find out, no, all of this is just an artifact. You got the basic science wrong. As a scientist, a former scientist, I have to be committed to the possibility that everything I said will be shown to be radically wrong because we screwed up in some basic scientific way. That's a possibility, and good scientists must be committed to actually finding out whether that in fact is the case. But I'm suggesting there's a lot here to suggest that the best science that we have shows the lie of colorblindness. Simply by saying we're colorblind by no means suggests that we are colorblind. And given that fact, we have to try to figure out what we might do about it, especially because we can measure it. If the single greatest downside of winning the civil rights battles in the 50s and 60s is to get everyone basically on the same normative page of judging people by the content of their character instead of the arbitrariness of their skin, the single greatest downside of that is that we lost an empirical consensus that racism existed. Now we think we've turned the page, we're all on the same normative page, racial discrimination is bad, it's just that empirically now we think it's gone. There is no more race discrimination, except for those pesky affirmative action programs, and that's why we have to pass 209. Right? The assumption now is basically, except on the fringes, sure there are people who still wear sheets and stuff at night, but on their heads, I mean. So, except for the really crazy cases, racism doesn't exist anymore. And so what we have is this ugly problem of clearing up some debts from past baggage. And a lot of people say, look, Justice Scalia makes this point. My father was an immigrant. He did not enslave blacks. He probably never met a black until he came to the United States. Why should he or himself have to pay for the wrongs done by some other people? It's not as if whiteness is a corporation that you buy shares into, right? And you have to pay debts. The debts do not go forward over time. So what this science shows is that the empirical claim that we might all want to hope for, that there is no more racial prejudice or racial discrimination, is ridiculous. You might have always thought it's ridiculous, but telling a story of discrimination is no longer as powerful as showing a regression that demonstrates that we are not colorblind and that there are consequences. I want to finish by suggesting that this has radical implications for how we think about law. I'm not going to go through all this because I do want to drive it through questions. And maybe I'll only talk about how we might reframe race and then tell you how I've used it in lots of contexts, ranging from affirmative action to mass media policy. First point. We should have great humility about limited self-knowledge. You think you know a lot, it turns out we don't know a lot. And anyone who arrogantly says, either about him or herself, or about generally society, that they know how much race or racism there is, you don't have a clue. And if you think that somehow because you're a person of color you're immunized to that nonsense, good luck. It ain't true. It's likely not true. It might be true, it's likely not true. And we have to have great humility about the lack of information we have about ourselves. Second, in some sense, we could actually create new consensus based on the present, not necessarily the past. Arguments about corrective justice are very difficult because anytime you want to correct something that happened a long time ago means that you kind of move around goodies today. And when you move around goodies today, people claim, those are my goodies. You cannot take my goodies and give them to somebody else because somebody else a long time ago screwed up. Right? Basic arguments about corrective justice are difficult, especially if they're about correcting sins of the past, sins of our forefathers. The idea is, it's not my fault. I'm a little sorry, I'm okay with progressive taxation, but I'm not going to give you any more than that. That's the idea. But the claim here is no longer about correcting something that happened bad in the past during the evil times. The argument is, no, we're correcting stuff that's happening right now. How we measure people, how we interact with people, how we shoot people, how we evaluate people, all that stuff's happening right now. And we should do something about it. Doesn't necessarily mean sue them immediately, but maybe it does mean implementing particular fair measures. I suggest there are particular legal benefits from it in constitutional analysis, but I don't think that's worth talking about right now. So if you like the trope of equality of opportunity versus equality of results, again, this stuff actually helps, this scientific information, because it's not about an argument for some basic amount of distributive justice. It's not as if, well, all Americans deserve to go to UCLA, regardless of their color, regardless of their test scores, and therefore you have to give them a slot at UCLA. It's not just some claim that every single American deserves a certain type of minimum goodie, and we should give them those goodies regardless of merit or desert or any particular individual choices. It's not about that. It's about the fact that people's life trajectories should not be meaningfully changed by the accident of a particular social category that they fall into. The fact that I look like this, or my parents came from a particular country, should not meaningfully alter my life trajectory. That's about equality of opportunity. But I'm telling you right now, the junk in our heads act as gravitational fields that take you off course in a little way. And the question is, if you can counter that gravitational force, should you not do it morally and legally? And finally, instead of thinking about as sin, as a particular evil perpetrator that people get so offended with, why not think about it as pollution? It is a form of cultural pollution, right? Think about the stuff that we watch on TV. Think about the fears that we have from watching local news. The idea is not that you are evil because you have implicit bias. We all have it. It's just a product of living in a society and the fact that we have to chunk information by categories. But it is pollution that hurts not all of us, just some of us. And the question then becomes, if pollution hurts some of us, but not all of us, should we agree to fix that problem? Not that you're an evil dumper of toxic waste, although some media companies might arguably be accused of some such things, right? But the idea is, look, you live in this society, you pollute, and you consume pollution. We should do something about that, especially when it has inequitable consequences on people and fellow Americans. I think it has really interesting implications for affirmative action. It has really interesting implications for mass media policy. It has really interesting implications for how we think about Title VII law. And I'm happy to talk about all those things, but I've talked in some sense too much. I want to focus on the science so that I give you an introduction to what's going on and what's arguably new. But then I want to switch now to questions so that I could actually deal with questions and then kind of leverage into my answers any other new points that seem important. So, questions? Yeah.
I was just having a discussion about this stuff with a good friend last night, and he's a white man, and he's been in some social science classes where race discussion has been feeling very, very threatened. I think he's feeling very, very much like people are blaming him for oppressing them. His main complaint was that all of this talk and focus on race, not that he was thinking that we are colorblind, but aren't we sort of making the problem just worse, just perpetuating the problem by focusing on differences instead of focusing on what brings us together as humans, what brings us together as Americans. And I didn't really have, I was just trying to respond to that and sort of talking about, oh, well, there's a lot of things that you are benefiting from that you don't necessarily realize, and sort of trying to get at this stuff really articulately. Basically, they didn't have a good answer for that. So
Yeah.
I mean, this is a common, I think, concern that people raise, that can't we just get along and can't we get beyond race? And I think it is, parts of me want to be very skeptical and cynical about this kind of move. But then if I want to try to deal with it as sincerely as possible, it's not a stupid point, right? They're trying to say, look, I realize something bad has happened. It's not helping us now. Does the strategy of focusing so much on race actually help race relations or racial justice? And this argument is brought up over and over again on, say, affirmative action policies. Does that increase balkanization, which actually hurts the idea of actually improving race relations? I don't think that that's an entirely stupid or ungrounded kind of claim, and we should take it. Again, we should read people's objections at their very best. Certainly that is an academic virtue, if not a political one. So parts of the things that you want to say is to make clear, well, not focusing on race is not an option. What I mean by that is the presumption is, by default, if we don't talk about it, we're not focusing on race. And I think people sincerely believe that, right? The truth is, it's just not true. And the best evidence that we have are these studies that suggest, well, if you really think you're colorblind, just do the test. You should come at 0. There's no reason why you should associate white faces with good better than black faces with good. Just take the test. Why did you show a difference if you say you're colorblind? On all these metrics. So the idea that you're colorblind turns out to be empirically inaccurate. Now, if they want to say, well, it doesn't matter, notwithstanding I see color or gender or other kinds of stuff, then they have to make the case why the junk in their head actually has no practical consequences when you think that there are good reasons now to think that there are practical consequences, as I've demonstrated in some of the predictive validity studies. That's part of it. But you should actually concede some value, right? Concede some strength in the argument. What I mean by that is there is some reason to think that explicit primes on race don't always help people out. So I didn't talk at all about some of the stereotype threat studies, but it does turn out that if you actually emphasize race sometimes in particular ways, you could lead people to choke in their performance in other kinds of ways. So I'm not suggesting that explicit primes about race is always such a good thing. If you think about, so there's some studies, for example, dealing with Asian women and how they perform on math tests. And if you implicitly, very subtly prime them to think that they're Asian, they overperform. If you subtly prime them to think that they're women, they underperform. Versus the control group on math SAT scores. But if you actually explicitly prime Asians, and if you tell Asians, well, you're Asian, you should be great at math, you're going to rock, take this test. Turns out they do worse. They actually choke. So what I'm saying is there might be some reasons why there's some reasons to think that focusing on race might not always be beneficial. And you have to concede that fact, but it's always at one cost and always have to be situational about it. The lesson of all this implicit social cognition, I think, is to suggest that most of the solutions have to come structurally and environmentally and situationally, in which case the way you deal with race might not have to be explicit commandments calling people evil or not evil. It might be just changing the environment in interesting ways. So I'm completely not interested in trying to find evil people in our midst, and I'm completely uninterested in trying to suggest that I'm holier than you because I've got the red book or the pink book and I've read it and I've absorbed it. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in end results of stopping this kind of pollution problem. And I think the most powerful point is this point that I made earlier on. All of this presupposes that we are already colorblind. The answer is we're not. And so if you really care, we have to do something about it, even if it means doing something that's structural and not necessarily blaming individuals as evil or wrongful. Yep, right.
How much do academic institutions contribute to this on a K through 16? Because when we look at history books today, they continue to focus on the black and white, leave everybody else out. And we have very commercialized histories where Black History Month, so we'll focus, and then we focus on certain figures within Black History Month, or we have Hispanic Heritage Month, and then Cesar Chavez is like the only person who they really study about, right? And so, like, how much of that is perpetuated within academic institutions?
Yeah, so one way to think about this is what is the source of what I call racial meanings. If there are particular associations between, say, African Americans and weapons, or just hostility generally, including medieval weapons, now I'm, of course, thinking about... well, let me talk about what's the source of actual racial meanings, and to what extent do academic institutions play an important role? I think one way to think about this is to think about the difference between what I call direct versus vicarious experiences with the other. So direct experiences are just what's happening right now. You're having, in some sense, a direct real-world experience with me who happens to be an Asian American, and at least you put me into that category. And this experience is altering the cache of meanings you've associated with Asians. So if your association between Asians and the law or law professing wasn't that tight before because you've never actually met an Asian law professor, maybe you've never had an Asian teacher outside of someone who did either mathematics or engineering or taught you Chinese art history, it might be that after this engagement, this direct experience alters, at least for 24 hours, right, your implicit associations between Asian categories and something like law. So this is a direct experience. But it turns out we live in fairly segregated environments, right? If you think about where our homes are, and if our workplaces are not especially desegregated, and our universities decreasingly desegregated, a lot of the experiences are vicarious. What I mean by that, by vicarious, is that they come from mass media or stories we've been told, right? Books that we read, right? Little Sambo running around a tree becoming butter, making the tiger turn into butter. Little things that we experience as children, Barbie dolls that we see. A lot of them are vicarious experience. They're stories. And the stories not only come from mass media, but also from our history books. So what I'm saying is, if you think the implicit bias in our heads is problematic because it's both inaccurate and or leads to bad results, it's fair to say that a lot of it comes from actually vicarious experiences. I think that vicarious experiences, principally, so much of it is modern popular culture where media, mass media, and electronically communicated media have a greater impact than what our academic institutions do. But surely the lack of exposure in academic institutions could exacerbate things. You should know that there is some evidence, right? Aberson, so there's some evidence that social contact hypothesis applies to implicit bias. So Aberson does this study in 2004 where it's just measured on self-reports. He asked people, do you have a close black friend or a close Hispanic friend, and they actually run IATs. And there is a correlation between the number of close friends they have and the implicit bias scores that they show. And Pettigrew and Trope do a massive meta-analysis of over 700 social contact hypothesis studies that demonstrate that if you actually put people of different categories together, like different races together, it turns out on net it does decrease prejudice, bad attitude towards the other group. So there's pretty good evidence that social contact, actual integration, even though by no means it's an easy question, think about Israel and Palestine and other kinds of stuff, right? But close contact interaction does, roughly speaking, improve attitudes across the category so that there's less prejudice. So direct experiences actually might help. The vicarious stuff, I think, is a lot of junk, and it's because of the markets that produce it. And I think academic institutions are somewhat responsible for not at least countering that junk, and oftentimes, at least in the past, affirmatively increasing the amount of it. Now, the final thing that I want to say about academic institutions is, in some sense, think about what faculty are, right? Lots of times we think of them as, quote, role models, but I want to think about them instead as debiasing agents. So the argument for affirmative action for people on this side oftentimes is to suggest that somehow by being exposed to people who are not the standard type of professor, we're actually making role models of them. So, to see Professor Cheryl Harris means that all the black women in the room could imagine a future where you could be a law professor commanding an audience with her kind of authority and expertise. And that role model is something very important for us to have in our culture. Lots of people hate this argument. They go ballistic over it because they say, why should you be limited by just your social category? You should be able to see anyone as a role model, right? Colin Powell should be a role model for everyone, not just black men. How dare you do that? People get insulted at the idea that there should be essentially a form of racial and gender tracking on your ability to dream. Debiasing agents, this idea actually changes things in interesting ways. The idea is not so much about whether or not the person is a, quote, role model that helps only particular racially tracked beneficiaries. The idea is everyone needs scrubbing. If you find someone who has countertypic qualities that run counter to the existing stereotypes, then, by putting that person above in front of the room, just like seeing pictures of Tiger Woods, in some sense, acts as a scrubber. I'm a disinfecting agent. I am Lysol to my students, Asian and non-Asian. Frankly, I'm more concerned about scrubbing the brains of the non-Asian students because likely there's more increased negative attitudes and more prejudices from the non-Asian students. In that way, it's not about increasing dreams of people where people might think, well, I don't know what to think about that. It seems kind of corny. Why should I be that constrained? This is purely anti-discrimination. If I think future lawyers should not have implicit biases against black people, and if I think by having this kind of countertypical black professor actually decreases their implicit bias, then we do something good by generating and graduating a whole cadre of lawyers who are more likely to be fair in the legal community once they graduate. So that would be a different kind of argument. So I think academic institutions do play some interesting role, including an ameliorative role that's possible in the future by encouraging the idea of debiasing agents. And I also want to say, as a matter of constitutional law, this has been rejected. Role models doesn't fly under current constitutional law. Debiasing agents, actually, because its core mission is to stop discrimination, as I've argued in a paper called Fair Measures, actually could withstand constitutional and Title VII scrutiny. More questions? Yeah, right there.
In terms of a structural, like, thing, the mass, like, population is generally educated, or a form of education through the media.
Yeah.
Right? So when we're talking about media and media portrayal, just say music videos and TV, how do we counter that without like falling on the boundaries of censorship?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I actually wrote a full article called "The Trojan Horses of Race," and that's in the Harvard Law Review in 2005, and there's a link up to it on the website that talks about this. Well, one point that I would want to try to emphasize is first do no harm, and what I mean by that, by first do no harm, is the following. In the most recent FCC report and order on mass media consolidation, they had to decide whether or not to allow media companies to get bigger and bigger and by what standards they would decide things. As they articulated the definition of, quote, the public interest, which is required by the Communications Act. So when you give a license, an exclusive license to broadcast at a particular frequency to a radio station or a television station, in exchange for getting something that's quite valuable for free, they have to serve the, quote, public interest. The public interest is a very vague standard. It includes notions of competition, localism, and diversity. But the way that the FCC operationalized it was the FCC said the following: the public interest equals more local news. Because local news is nonfiction information. We need news. It's diverse. It's local. Someone said, Fox said, hey, why don't you count Will and Grace? That's diverse. It's kind of a countertypical portrayal of a gay man. Or The Cosby Show. Why not? Why shouldn't that be diversity? FCC doesn't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole for obvious reasons in some sense. How do you make a decision about whether that's, quote, diverse? They all keyed off local news. The problem with more local news is, you know what's on local news? What's on local news is just horrific. What's on local news is actually violent crime shows, right? It's not a show. It's violent crime. If it bleeds, it leads. So Frank Gilliam, who's of this faculty, right, at UCLA, does this great thing with a mugshot. He takes all these participants in LA, over 2,000 of them, that represents Los Angeles. He asks them questions about fear of crime, whether or not crime is because they have bad genetics and culture, or it was just kind of the circumstances, and how punitive they want it to be. To different sets of people. Some people saw a 10-minute news show with a mugshot of a black person. Some people saw the same news show with a mugshot of a white person. Some people saw no mugshot, no crime story at all. Here's what happens. If you see a crime story, it's just crime stories that's like 2 minutes out of a 10-minute show. The mugshot is 5 seconds. You see a black mugshot, on the survey, you're 6% more punitive on these survey results. If you see a white mugshot, you're statistically not different. You're like 1% more, but not in a statistically significant way. You're not more punitive than the control, where you don't actually see the crime story at all. So this is evidence by survey, by explicit self-reports, that if you see violent crime stories, then you're going to be actually concerned about criminal justice and want to go after the out-group, the people you think are most threatening, namely black males. So when I say do no harm, my point is basically that the FCC, by defining things in purely local news terms, actually define public interest in a perverse way. How do you stop it? One thing that I've argued in favor of is what I call debasing PSAs. So right now, what counts as the public interest? Basically nothing. Basically, you show 3 hours of children's educational TV every week, and you try to get by with, this is, Bugs Bunny teaches Hunter how to hunt more effectively, and that's educational TV. There's an attempt to try to satisfy the public interest in very weak ways. I would rather have devising public service announcements. So remember, after 9/11, there was actually a very powerful, I think it was only about 30 seconds, where you had people who looked not white, who didn't sound like Midwestern folks, who said, I am an American. I am an American, in all different accents and all different colors. I thought that was actually quite powerful. You might have thought it was hokey. You might be too skeptical about that stuff. I thought it was powerful, and there's no reason why you couldn't actually find out, just like whether exposure to Tiger Woods or O.J. Simpson or to Bill Cosby or Katarina Witt, if exposure to these images actually decrease your bias for 24 hours, there's no reason why
people shouldn't be running debiasing public service announcements. That should be the way, right? We have celebrities do that already. Violence don't play that game. Why isn't that, if you show via social science, has a bigger impact on implicit bias? That's more important than running more local news. Do you want 4 hours of local news on the independent channel over and over and over again, showing highway chases that lead to gunshots, right? Is that what you're interested in? Or do you want to see devising public service announcements? I'm more interested, actually, in trying to suggest that this is more valuable. And in fact, if you think, isn't that mind control, that censorship, there are ways to say, look, we already, at least in the mass media, for spectrum usage, we already govern it. Here's another way to put it. Why is the F word sanctionable on the order of $250,000, but not the N word? We regulate the hell out of broadcast already. You show a wardrobe malfunction, it's $500,000, right? So when did we decide that a nipple screws up America far more than the N-word or things that increase implicit bias and lead us to shoot black people faster? When did we make that policy call? On basis of what science, right? Why do we just assume that's okay and people aren't jumping up and down on the censorship of not being able to see Janet Jackson's wardrobe malfunction, right? We don't think of that as a First Amendment crisis, and yet we think any possibility of trying to encourage devising public service announcements might be. There's ways to do this voluntarily, right? And so you want to do the public interest, you could show public service announcements. People do already show public service announcements, and I've made claims in greater detail on why that's possible within the confines of First Amendment law. More questions? A few more? Yeah, right.
How about the role of governments in overseeing that their lawmaking and policymaking is free of colorblindness? I've been recently working with I work for the Ontario government on a new health plan, which is more community and regional based. And we've been working on consultations with Aboriginal groups, and there's been a lot of lawyers that have been involved in the discussions on how we will approach the consultations and how we can ensure that their interests are being met and that they are feeling that they're on an even par with everyone else who's interested in the new way that Ontario's health is going to look. So how have you seen governments as being involved in ensuring that we are more staying away from being colorblind and sort of in their policies and lawmaking?
So I'm not sure if I understood entirely the question, but part of it includes the idea of what would a responsible government do based on this science in reorganizing or organizing various structures, social and legal, including different sorts of communities situated in different kinds of areas. The fundamental insight has to be what I started off with in response to the first question. If you think that we are colorblind already, all the decisive scientific evidence is to the contrary. That's the first thing. The second thing is that there are things that are going on in our brains that are implicit cognitive processes that have real-world impacts in different kinds of ways. So let me talk about one thing. Like education ought to be important. And there's a whole line of research that I didn't even talk about called stereotype threat that suggests that if there are negative stereotypes about your people, it might actually lead you to underperform on an objective test, like taking a math test. So if you really think that there's something, if you have the anxiety that by performing badly, you will provide more evidence that favors and supports the negative stereotype about your people, then it turns out that you might in fact do much worse. And so Claude Steele at Stanford started this research, and there are lots of really remarkable studies where people underperform because there's a stereotype against their community being good at what they're trying to do, and they're somehow mildly reminded of their membership in that identity. There are certain ways to fight stereotype threat, and one of the things, for example, turns out to be that if you really think of intelligence, for example, as being malleable, that's a really important facet of whether or not people suffer stereotype threat. If you think intelligence is either God-given or genetic, that you're either smart or not smart, it turns out you're much more susceptible to this kind of weird disruption. So there have been interventions that Catherine Wood, for example, has done in a Texas very poor community, principally minority kids, where by intervening with mentors in a group, one group was given a lot of mentoring support, but they were told, don't do drugs. Another group was given identical mentoring, homework help, and all that kind of stuff. But what they were told is intelligence is malleable. They were indeed shown a video that graphically showed how neurons actually create new dendrites as they're exposed to different kinds of information. And it turns out in that context, even with very poor minority kids, the gender gap in math, which usually exists, right at 7th grade on a standardized test actually disappear, and the girls performed actually slightly better than the boys. This is a little bit off of your question in some sense, but once you define the community of need that you want to focus on, it makes sense to leverage the best information that we have, including the science that we have, to create sensible educational policy. So it has always been my goal to emphasize, right, for example, even to law students, that everything is doable, that it is in fact effort. And if you create a weird self-fulfilling prophecy, that if you tell them there is no stereotype threat here, if you tell them that everything is doable, it turns out people in fact succeed in that way. I think we've run out of time. Thank you very much for your attention.
For those of you who have already registered for the lunch and you have this yellow ticket, please go ahead to 1314. It's down the hall to the right. For those of you who are registered for the lunch but do not have the yellow ticket, please see registration right out here. Because of the limited number of space, if you are interested in going to the roundtable lunch, you can hang out for about 15 minutes and then check at 1314 to see if anyone has canceled last minute.